I see trees of green.
First of all, thanks for having us along. I was reading a bit about the agroforestry courses and particularly reading about Rowan Reed, who was obviously one of the founders of this whole exercise, and admired his dedication and of course the way he's tried to integrate all the facets of what you guys may be considering. It's a great forum for me to be talking into. And I'm not sure whether you know much about the essential oil industry or about me, but let me just bore you a bit with what I'm about to tell you how I got to it. So, as a small kid, I was constantly at my cousin's farm at West Wylam, which is, if you know the area, is central west New South Wales, described as marginal country, but farming enterprises usually was some sort of grain mix with some sort of stock, mainly sheep. And from then on, I fell in love with the sheep industry. So I'm already talking down what I'm talking about today. But from that, the first thing, if I look back, I noticed in the 60s that farming practices were very different. As far as I'm aware, even at that young age, there was basically no chemicals involved in the production of grain. It was all cultivation. There was tree belts everywhere. So that was my first fond remembrance of that era. And of course, over time, things change a lot, with good intent, I think, but not always with a good outcome. But through my career, when I started my first serious job, I was working with the Wool Testing Authority, which was, I was there for 11 years. And in that era, there was the introduction of quality circles, quality assurance programs, all those things. And because it was scientifically based, it really embedded in me an appreciation, I guess, of what role science has in all aspects of that sort of work. And of course, it inspired me to go on to do further education. And effectively what that did was make me have a sole purpose of being involved in agribusiness. So as luck would have it, in my final tertiary education, I met someone who was in this caper called the essential oil industry. And they offered me a job, and I thought it was pretty good because A, it was in the region I loved, B, it did conventional farming as well, but importantly, it was focused on producing primarily eucalyptus oil, but others as well. And I was involved in the establishment of tea tree plantations in an area that most people would scoff at, but it worked. On the principle that we would capture water through the summer and irrigate the tea trees to the level that they would enjoy living, and a whole lot of things that went along with that. Of course, environments and climatic trends change, so you have to be always adaptable to how you approach your projects. Also in that era, when I first started in the central oil industry, the company I was working with was associated with some significant research scientists who had spent their life studying essential oils, especially Australian natives, and they imparted in me a real appreciation of the sort of work that was carried out in that era. From that, I just want to give you a brief history lesson. Essential oils isn't a new thing in Australia. It's that, in fact, Australia's commercial production of essential oils or raw materials dates back to the mid to late 1800s. And it might surprise you to learn that the biggest distiller of essential oils in the Southern Hemisphere existed and operated in WA in the 1920s. And it was focused on sandalwood, which was a natural resource that people just took and processed to produce the product. And initially without any regard for the regeneration of those stands of sandalwood. But this particular company I have in mind is called Claymar, and they were very focused on ensuring that the resources were replaced. And in the case of sandalwood, the whole plant's taken, including the roots, so they had to have a replacement policy. So they decided to plant sandalwood along all the rail corridors, and that legacy exists today. And then they started to broaden their interests, which led them to study the growth and processing of boronia and ultimately eucalyptus. And their operations expanded the width of Australia. There are others, of course, that were also active in that space, and one that brings to mind is a company called Faldings in South Australia. The Faldings back in the day had focused on eucalyptus and decided that they should isolate cineol, which is a component prevalent in most eucalyptus of commercial interest. And they developed a method of isolating that component, and together with an assistant called Joseph Resisto, they developed products which were immediately available commercially globally based on that isolated component in eucalyptus. So alongside that era, in the 20s especially and onwards until probably the late 60s, there was a Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences and a department in which was the study of essential oils. And there's some names here that probably don't mean much to you, but that do a lot to me. And Penfold, the likes of Penfold, Eric Lassack, Joe Brophy and so on, studied what natively grew in Australia and that had some commercial significance, but they studied everything and decided against certain species or genuses and focused on the ones that they thought could be developed. So there was that whole body of work that happened in the late 1800s right through to the 1970s that armed us with a lot of information about what grew here, where it grew, and what was in the plant and how we could extract it. And all of that, I had the great fortune of meeting the end of a lot of those guys' careers. So I couldn't have thought of having a better introduction into this industry. So armed with that introduction and an appreciation for science, I entered the essential oil industry, and as said, I existed in that space for the last 25 years. And I've always been hungry for knowledge and always a great observer of the trends and the changes in social attitudes to farming, because it's in my blood. And I want to make sure that we've got a sustainable future in that space. Now, like all industries, and two that bring to mind straight away, Australia is what could be classified as good intent, set up other countries to grow the stuff we're growing here in the avenue of supplying seed. So in the case of eucalyptus, we saw an explosion of production out of the areas like China, South America, and South Africa. And what happened is that somehow eucalyptus became a generic product, and it was all price dependent. And a lot of people who had gone into eucalyptus production in Australia of various species went out of it because it was no longer competitive. But of course, as you guys probably know, today there's a different mindset. And why I formed Native Oils Australia was because in my previous experience and in my travels, there was a few things that constantly came out. One was, okay, so Australia does this, this and this, what else can it do? What's new in Australia? So that was the first thing. The second thing was that I got very involved in organisations like the Essential Oil Producers Association, and of which today I'm the president, but you know, it's often by default, if you know the sort of organisation. But me and the secretary have this huge ambition to not only diversify what Australia can do, but also to grow it to commercial levels so that Australia can become some sort of essential oil provider to the world. And we're forced to look back, which is why I've just done that, but we're also forced to look through what's trending, what would motivate any sort of farmer to do something else that's very different from what they're used to doing. And generally, there is a support mechanism behind people's motivations outside of their personal ones. And these exist in industry groups. So in the case of tea tree, as you might all know, that it's the largest essential oil producer of its type in Australia, supported by a group who are hell-bent on producing better varieties, marketing it as an Australian origin product, and describing it in such a way that there's some differential between what's done here and what's done in other countries. And of course, our generosity continues, so we keep supplying seed to other countries who keep growing stuff that's getting closer and closer to what happens here. Another one is the lavender that's grown in Tasmania. It's always been at a level of commerciality. There's a lot of boutique producers who have different motivations why they might grow lavender, not always for oil, sometimes for the flower, sometimes for the tourism, all sorts of applications. In the space of eucalyptus, I've been flummoxed by the fact that every eucalyptus is measured on its price. What my company has done is we've been producing several varieties of essential oil species, converting to essential oil. And we're marketing it as that species specific because they all have different qualities. And as you probably know, they also grow in very varied environmental conditions. Some grow well on the coast, some on the highlands, some out west. And they're all different. And rather than try and say, well, you know, okay, it's a bit dearer than the Chinese oil, but it has these qualities, and then having a discussion about how much cheaper you can provide it, we should be having a discussion about how different it is and why it's worth what it's worth. And of course, in the sandalwood industry, if you're in that industry, there's a lot of major investment groups that have set up plantations. Not attractive to everyone unless you want to lose some tax somewhere, but you know, they're a 20-year proposition, and at the end of that 20 years, you rip the plant out and distill the oil and get a proceed, and then you have to replant. So, you know, there's some oils that continue to be made, but I, in my opinion, think that we have a greater propensity to produce a much varied type of product that is both native and in our case especially is non-native. So Australia can grow other origin product here, like rosemary, like things like vetiver. If you look at the Queensland government, for example, they grow vetiver or up their major arterial highways as a land stabiliser. Vetiver is also a product of interest with us, so there's that potential. There's camellia, there's moringa, there's all these sorts of products that Australians could explore as potential industries. And what I want to try and do is give you a motivation now on several levels as to why I think we should pursue it. Now, in my experience, farmers have had a greater appreciation than any other industry, I think, that measures the effort and the reward. Now, the reward I'll go to later, but the reward for most farmers is economic, but it's also environmental and a whole lot of other issues. And in fact, you'll find that there's been a lot of projects that have planted trees either advertently or inadvertently to control something that has manifested as a potential essential oil as well. And I think Rowan Reed has done a lot of work in that space all over Australia in identifying a problem, providing a solution which in itself has a dual purpose, and I'll get to that shortly. But I know that farmers appreciates, I guess, that their continued existence is dependent on how they go about everything they do. And that's not only their immediate existence or continuation, but the long-term one. And I've seen farms degrade over time because their focus has been too much on one aspect of their operation and not on the other. And the balance is the thing that's important in getting right, in my view, to have sustainable agriculture into the future. And farmers need to understand their limitations, and that can be the environmental impacts that occur on their enterprise, and we've seen in more recent years all the extremes. We've just got through flooding up our way. We're operating on a farm that's on an island that was cut off for a few days, which was an interesting experience. This time last year was covered up to probably 2 metres in water in areas that had never been covered before. So we certainly can first-hand appreciate what we're dealing with and maybe offer some suggestions on how you can address that. In the essential oil industry, unlike a lot of other farming enterprises like wool or grain, there's no central selling mechanism. I mean, there's probably not so much now in wool anyway, or in wheat, but certainly in the 70s I remember the wool board and the wheat board, and everyone produced as much as they were told to produce, and they supplied it, and they had a guaranteed price, and all that was wonderful. The essential oil state doesn't and never has had that. And in Australia, outside of individual essential oil production, like tea tree, have never had a selling mechanism outside of put it to the market and see what they can get. We're hoping to try and change that too, but the thing that made me form native oils, outside of what I've already said, was that because we have this broad understanding of agriculture and what farmers are trying to do in terms of making a living, etc. Let's take the example of wheat and wool farming. If wheat wasn't going so well, and if wool wasn't going so well, and there's been times like that, we wondered, okay, so what can you have as an integrated enterprise into that system that doesn't have the same impacts as a product that's regarded as a commodity, but has at least a dual, if not several possibilities, and in our case it was essential oils. And I think it's probably important for us to be, we're very mindful that this is an integration, this isn't an either or, it's an addition, that something that can achieve a whole lot of objectives outside of another commercial income stream. So it was about creating diversity and undertaking those sorts of things as a company was firstly to show traditional farmers how this could happen, how they could capitalise on the resources that were once considered, just land management. And if I just go down that path for a tick, we've in South Australia, for example, spent over a year harvesting what was 576 kilometres of blue mallee and Loxleys, which are two eucalyptus varieties, that were planted originally as a carbon capture down cropping paddocks across the entire 7,500 acres. So great intent to start with, but it was a personal deal between the carbon capturer and the farmer, and he relied on a royalty for the land he'd given up and what he provided for them to plant their trees. But over time, of course, things changed and the carbon company stopped paying them royalties, which in the contract said that it was now the farmers. And the farmer rang me and said, okay, I got these trees, they're in the way. What can we do? And we went down that path of saying, well, are they in the way? They'll put there to capture carbon, so they're doing something good. But as luck would have it, they've got commercially valuable trees, and they can be managed in a way that they continue to regenerate every year or every 2 years after harvest, and that you're not removing one potential as a carbon capturer by doing the other. They can work in harmony. So we started the harvest and we set up distillation on farm, and we worked there for a year and a half, and eventually he took it over and he's still doing it to this day. In other aspects, people have grown plants because someone said it was a good idea, not usually theirs, and they've thought over time, well, I've got no resource to make use of these trees, they're just getting bigger and in the way. And again, we had come in and said, look, we can, as like the South Australian example, we can make this work and have. Now, as you know, a lot of these trees, not only for carbon capture, but to control salinity, and I know that Rowan's talked about that in the past, and they talk about the management of nutrient cycling, and we've also talked about the hydrolysis of the water through the soil. And as we can all appreciate, I think trees are a massive asset in that domain. What I've found though, I was going to say this later, I'll say now. What I've found is that and I've been exposed to this firsthand, was that I was working on this property that had 15,000 acres, half on conventional farming, half on eucalyptus and tea tree. And then we were approached by the Australian National University to say, well, did you know that there's probably a net positive gain in carbon capture? And that if we do the measures, we could justify that that's an option. And we said, yeah, let's explore that. But before we knew it, other bigger organisations had come in and laid down some ground rules about how this can go forward. So what I've found in recent times is that farmers have leased parts of their land for a third party to put trees in for the purposes of capturing carbon. Now the downside to that is that these lease agreements entitle the lessor to have caveats over those tree lots to the point where they can dictate to the farmer what they can do near those tree lots. The second thing is that it's up to 100 years in perpetuity. So if the farmer decides he wants to sell, and we've had this first-hand experience, we couldn't believe the value of a property in the Central West, so we approached the agent and he said, oh, not another one. And I said, oh, what's the problem? He said, well, it's so cheap because there's always lease agreements and caveats and very long leases that survive the sale of the land. and unless you've got the cash to buy it, no bank will look at it because it's just too problematic. So that led me to think, okay, what can we do about that? So I've got some really good colleagues at Southern Cross University in northern New South Wales who I think are above the waterline. And we've hatched some research to see whether we can prove scientifically that a tree that's kept in continual growth cycles out to say 8 years and is harvested and continues to regrow captures more carbon than if a tree is left idle for up to 100 years. We already sort of know the answers, but that's science. We just need to have it done and proved. And the second thing is that in the essential oil industry, there's the primary extraction method is by steam, which means you cut the biomass, you marry it to some steam flow, and you get the oil and hydrosolar out, and then there's a spent biomass. So for us, the first thought was, well, okay, that biomass can be used as mulch. But apparently the rules and regulations that exist today say that mulching isn't enough. So we looked into saying, well, what is enough? And the answer to that was biochar. So we're now exploring how we can convert spent biomass to biochar to re-enter the soil. And I assume you guys know what advantages there is in biochar and soil condition. But anyway, I digress. So what Native Oils tries to do and continues to try to do is to lead by example. So we've got our own farm, we lease a couple of farms, and we're doing plantation management, development, establishment, all those things. And we're trying to get farmers to lean over the fence to get inquisitive around what we're doing. We're talking to everyone we can talk to that has an interest in this. And as I said, we're physically doing the work. So we've got our own equipment. We make what we can't get. We adapt what might be available that doesn't quite work. And we're doing all those things in either concert with the farmer or for the farmer. And that requires quite a large investment from us, but we're happy to do it if the outcome is we have a much more diverse and larger essential oil producing industry in Australia. But that's not our own motivation. We're trying to also differentiate the product, as I alluded to, in the eucalyptus from what's globally accepted as eucalyptus oil. Isn't quite the truth. There's aromatic and components in those oils that make it different from what is generally accepted. We're continuing to evaluate natives and non-natives. The difference between natives, we work in conjunction with Indigenous groups who've got a long history of application. What we're trying to do is determine why they worked. Now, they're not all necessarily essential oils either. They are extracts, infusions, and in that space we're looking at different extraction methods that allow us to get more out of a plant that might be a commercial valuable application. We're also developing other harvest and extraction methodologies, and as I said, we're building the equipment. So I hope I'm not too scattered, but I formed Native Oils Australia because of the reasons I've said. But one of the motivations was, well, it's not just about the natives, it's about what else we can produce. So in that space, we already have producers who are growing things like Palmarosa. We're growing oils like, we had a community processor up north. We're trialling rosemary and geranium different plant varieties because we think that they have already a global market, and the appeal of it coming from Australia and grown in Australia seems to be still fairly strong. So we're looking at natives and we've identified up to 200 different species for various reasons, not all of them being essential oil. So my daughter is nicely doing the slides for me. It was also the heir apparent to this throne. We were talking earlier about how do we think of ourselves as a company? Do we think of ourselves as an essential oil company? Well, yes, but only in part. We think of ourselves as a solution provider to people who have properties that need increasing amounts of attention in terms of making sure that their properties are regenerative and sustainable. So I wanted to just look at, I've mentioned biochar, but the diversity of the production options is quite and growing quite large. We're looking at things like how waste product is treated now and what's valuable in waste. So let's take one example. In the case of avocados, we're all about the flesh, we're not about the nut, or what's in the nut. And then, we know that companies throw out 20 tonnes of nuts every year. Is there something in that we might be able to extract some way to make it a valuable commodity? So we're looking at waste. We're also working with partners in places like Dubbo. So this proposition came up that a miner has a licence to mine something. Now the mine itself is 100 acres, but the EPA require them to manage something like 10 times that area around it to ensure that there's the biodiversity is maintained and that the invasive species are controlled in a manner that's acceptable to them. So what we've done is set up a production system on the land that these mines have bought, and we're producing white cypress leaf and wood oil from those invading plants that, but the rules around that is that the mother trees are kept. We make sure that they still exist because they occur there naturally, but the EPA especially and so are us mindful that it can overtake properties if we're not careful. So we're managing that. We're looking, as I said before, into CO2 extraction, and I think it's probably the way of the future. But we need to understand the technology, understand what would be more valuable than the current systems in terms of its outcomes. But there's prohibitives there, and I'll touch on those a little later. So we're looking at application, we're looking at extraction, we're looking at waste management, and the fourth one is we're looking at partners who've approached us, for example, who are beekeepers. The beekeepers know that there's value in certain plant types that impart in the honey qualities that are probably desired in the marketplace. And they've approached us to say, well, if you grew this plant, and I'm talking about what we call jellybush, Polygalifolium leptospermum, and because they know that it produces a high active honey, if we could establish a plantation for the bees at flowering, and then after that extract the oil. So it's a byproduct of their main concerns, and we're happy to look at it, and we're looking at it now. So this leads to the essential oil producing plant, no matter how it's established, having at least a dual purpose. Now, I'd just like to touch on a few things that could be, I don't want to be too negative, but I need to make sure that you understand that in the case of the things you need to be mindful of when you go into essential oil production. There's a few barriers to entry, and we have
5 minutes,
solutions for it.
David.
Let's go through the barriers. The first is that there's companies in the past have had the ambition to lock up what they think they've got as a product and prohibit anyone else from doing it. Now, in the case of natives, you actually can't do that, but you have to be mindful of it, and you also have to be mindful of what you know you're producing and it's not being trademarked as a certain thing. So if you focus on the species, that's important. The second thing is that it's a long-term investment, essential oil production. So at the best case scenario, in a perfect environment, you can plant a tree and have its first harvest in 18 months' time. The worst case, 7 years. But there are a few things that I need to, and I'm sure you appreciate, that the purpose of planting an essential oil producing plant is not just about getting something out of it. It's also about ensuring that there's biodiversity in your production systems. I can tell you firsthand that the existence of tree belts around production systems encourages bird life, which encourages insect control. I'm sure you've heard of these guys, but there's two that I want to refer to. One was Peter Andrews, back from the Brink, who talks about the hydrolysis of the soil and the systems of planting things in your paddock to ensure that you've got good hydrolysis distribution, you've got clean water, you've got salt control. Then the second one, which is about sustainable agriculture, or he calls it regenerative agriculture, is Charles Massey. So both of those guys talk about a much broader set of principles than the case of producing a commercial crop of something. And so I said water distribution, nutrient recycling, and then there's the commerciality of it. So our proposition is that if you're going to need to grow some trees, consider essential oil producing ones. If you're going to want to do a layered system of windbreaks, etc., then think about an essential oil producing layered approach. So, as I digress again, I spent some time on Flinders Island, and the first thing I noticed when I got off the plane there was that there was this smell in the air. And it turned out to be a Melaleuca ericifolia, which was a commercially valuable crop.
David, you have 5 minutes. 5 more minutes, thank you.
I have 5 more minutes, okay. Anyway, we've set up a production system which utilises that, but I noticed the windbreaks have just been planted and forgotten. And so by the end of that growth cycle, you've got a couple of leaves at the top of a very tall stream, but in the case of Flinders Island, 10 to 90 degrees. So they're not managed. The intent's there, and they're probably effective the first couple of years, but after that, unless you manage them, they become ineffective. So that was, I kept one more case. In Tasmania, where you're all aware that gums are commissioned a whole lot of farmers to grow leaf gum trees to contribute to their chip industry ambitions. And they're not there anymore, and those trees are. And so farmers are saying, well, what do I do? Do I knock it out? And we're saying, well, you don't have to. You can have a sustainable essential oil producing opportunity. You can also have a leaf producing opportunity, which is the case on a lot of essential oils. And so we're exploring that, including setting up a distillation hub down there. So to cover some of the barriers, the distillation hub is probably the primary one. I don't think that anyone particularly wants to invest in a whole lot of plant equipment which they use once every 2 years. But for people with landholds, there's great ambition to have essential oil producing hubs where you bring your biomass to, they get distilled. So that capital investment's not there. You can take the biomass back, you pay a fee for service, and then you can carry on as if you had it on your place. So that's one of the major ones. The other one is that native oils, in all its capacities, would work with you to pick the right one for the right area, because things don't grow always in the same places everywhere. But from my point of view, and just to wrap up, essential oil production is a great option as a mix of enterprises for every farm in Australia, provided they just follow some protocols, which include understanding what grows where, but also from our point of view, contributes to the sustainability of their operation and the diversity of their operation.
I think to myself, what a wonderful